she had an affair with my ex-husband, and I'm fed up remembering all the times she used me and dumped me when I was no longer.
Whispers don't usually start this loudly, but this one detonated inside Toronto's elite circles like a dropped crystal glass. Jessica Mulroney, once inseparable from Meghan Markle, is no longer playing the gracious confidant. According to multiple insiders, she is done protecting a story that she believes cost her marriage, her career momentum, and years of emotional loyalty. The allegation she is privately voicing is explosive, that Meghan crossed a line so intimate it shattered trust beyond repair. Not drifting apart, not a misunderstanding, a betrayal that Jessica says involved her husband and a pattern of manipulation stretching back years. Those close to Jessica describe her mood not as impulsive rage, but calculated exhaustion. She has replayed the timeline, re-examined messages, and reinterpreted moments that once felt harmless. In her retelling, Meghan was never a sisterly ally, but a strategic presence who knew exactly when to lean in and when to disappear. Jessica allegedly says the friendship functioned like a transaction, one where access, introductions, and protection were freely given until they were no longer useful. To the public, their bond looked unbreakable. Two stylish women navigating fame together, presenting a united front across continents. But privately, sources claim the imbalance was obvious. Jessica opened doors Meghan could not open alone, embedding her into Canadian power circles with ease. In return, Meghan offered proximity to rising fame. It worked, until it didn't, and when the stakes rose, loyalty reportedly evaporated. The most damaging claim centers on Jessica's marriage to Ben Mulroney. Insiders allege there were prolonged moments of closeness that exceeded professional familiarity. Late nights, private conversations, situations that, in hindsight, felt inappropriate. Jessica is said to believe the relationship crossed into an affair, concealed behind the credibility of friendship. She reportedly confronted Meghan, expecting honesty, but walked away with silence and deflection instead. What makes this rupture different from celebrity fallouts before it is timing. Jessica's career had already taken hits, her marriage was straining, and public scrutiny was relentless. In that vulnerable moment, Meghan's withdrawal felt less like self-preservation and more like abandonment. Sources say Jessica internalized the damage, protecting Meghan's image while absorbing the fallout alone. Now, years later, the restraint is gone. Friends describe Jessica as finished with curated narratives that paint her as disposable, while others emerge untouched. She is not shouting accusations publicly, but she is no longer denying them privately, and in social circles where whispers travel faster than headlines, that distinction barely matters. This chapter marks the quiet beginning of a reckoning, one fueled less by revenge and more by reclamation. Jessica's alleged disclosures are circulating deliberately, shared with people who already know how power operates behind closed doors. Whether the claims ever reach a courtroom or remain social currency, the damage lies in credibility. Once doubt enters a polished image, it never fully leaves. It only waits. Silence has weight, and this one is growing heavier with every careful conversation that continues to ripple through influential rooms, long after smiles fade. As the whispers deepen, the backstory begins to look less like a sudden implosion and more like a slow burn that was always headed for collapse. Those familiar with the early days of Jessica and Meghan describe a friendship built quickly, intensely, and publicly. Meghan was ambitious, charming, and visibly hungry for elevation beyond the limits of an actress's career. Jessica, already embedded in Canada's most influential circles, offered not just companionship, but credibility. Invitations flowed, introductions happened casually but carried weight. Meghan didn't just meet people, she was positioned. Insiders say this is where the imbalance quietly took root. Jessica believed she was nurturing a genuine bond, one rooted in shared values and mutual loyalty. Meghan, by contrast, is described as hyper-aware of optics and utility. Every connection mattered. Every relationship had a shelf life determined by relevance. At first, the exchange felt equal. Meghan's rising profile brought attention to Jessica's work, while Jessica's access smoothed Meghan's ascent into rooms that mattered. But as Meghan's trajectory accelerated, the dynamic shifted. According to those close to Jessica, Meghan's interactions with Ben Mulroney began innocuously enough. Friendly conversations, shared jokes, professional overlap, nothing that would immediately trigger alarm. Yet, over time, the frequency and intimacy reportedly increased. Messages that didn't include Jessica, private exchanges during group events, lingering moments that felt unnecessary. Jessica is said to have brushed off early discomfort, trusting both her friend and her marriage. It wasn't until later, when fragments began to connect, that suspicion hardened into something darker. Friends recall Jessica confiding that certain timelines no longer made sense. Trips overlapped too neatly, stories didn't align. And when she sought reassurance, she allegedly received evasion rather than clarity. Meghan, sources claim, became distant whenever boundaries were questioned, framing concern as insecurity and deflecting accountability. The royal relationship changed everything. Once Meghan's life pivoted toward global prominence, her dependency on Jessica diminished sharply. Calls slowed, responses shortened, the warmth cooled. To Jessica, the shift felt brutal. To outsiders, it looked like natural distance. But insiders insist the timing was too precise to ignore. Meghan had secured what she needed. The latter was no longer required. When Jessica later faced public backlash of her own, she expected at least private support. Instead, she reportedly received silence. That absence, friends say, cut deeper than any headline. It forced her to reassess not just the present, but the past. Moments she once dismissed began to look calculated. Generosity reframed itself as exploitation. Trust curdled into regret. This is where the alleged affair stops being just about infidelity and becomes, in Meghan's mind, a symbol of a larger pattern, a willingness to cross personal boundaries if the reward justified the risk. Those close to her say she doesn't describe Meghan as reckless, but as precise, someone who understands power dynamics instinctively and acts accordingly, even when the collateral damage is personal. Now, as these accounts circulate quietly among media insiders and social elites, the narrative around Meghan's carefully maintained image faces subtle erosion. No public statement is required. Doubt does the work on its own. And Jessica, no longer interested in shielding anyone else at her own expense, is allowing that doubt to breathe. What makes this chapter particularly volatile is not just the allegation itself, but the silence surrounding it. In elite circles, silence is rarely accidental. It is strategic, a currency traded when words carry too much risk. Those close to Meghan interpret her lack of response as confidence, the same tactic she has used before when controversy swirled. But those aligned with Jessica see it differently. They view the quiet as calculation, buying time while weighing how much exposure is too much. Behind the scenes, Jessica's mindset has reportedly shifted from wounded loyalty to controlled resolve. Friends say she no longer speaks emotionally about Meghan, but analytically. The hurt is still there, but it's sharpened by clarity. She now frames the friendship as transactional from the start, with affection deployed only when it served advancement. That reframing, insiders say, has been both devastating and liberating. It allows Jessica to stop blaming herself for missing red flags and start recognizing patterns she ignored out of love. Several mutual acquaintances have allegedly come forward privately to validate Jessica's suspicions, not with dramatic confessions, but with confirmations of discomfort they once felt and dismissed. Moments that felt off at the time now carry weight. A conversation overheard, a glance held too long, a private exchange explained away too quickly. None of it was explosive alone. Together, they form a picture that is difficult to unsee. What complicates matters further is Ben Mulroney's continued silence. Those close to him describe a man determined to move forward quietly, protecting his children and avoiding further spectacle. But his refusal to publicly deny the allegations has fueled speculation. In gossip ecosystems, denial matters almost as much as proof. The absence of it leaves space for interpretation, and that space is being filled rapidly. Jessica's divorce has become the emotional anchor for her claims. Supporters argue that marriages do not collapse in isolation. They fracture from accumulated breaches, emotional or otherwise. According to her inner circle, the alleged betrayal wasn't the sole cause, but it was the moment trust became unrecoverable. From that point on, everything unraveled. Counseling failed, distance grew. The damage, they say, was already embedded. Meanwhile, Meghan's broader pattern of fractured relationships continues to resurface in public discourse. Former friends, estranged family members, and professional fallouts are being re-examined through a new lens. Critics argue that while each split was once explained away as misunderstanding or boundary setting, the sheer volume suggests something systemic. Jessica's story slots into that pattern uncomfortably well. What makes this moment different is credibility. Jessica isn't an anonymous source or distant acquaintance. She was embedded deeply, publicly, and for years. Her children were part of Meghan's most watched milestone. Her home was a refuge. Her loyalty was visible. That proximity gives her claims a gravity that random accusations lack. As whispers evolve into structured narratives, the stakes escalate. If Jessica chooses to formalize her account, whether through interviews or documentation, the fallout could extend beyond personal reputation into brand partnerships and public trust. Meghan's image, meticulously constructed around authenticity and empowerment, would face its most intimate challenge yet. And for Jessica, speaking out is no longer about revenge. It's about reclaiming authorship of a story that, for too long, was written without her consent. As the narrative gains momentum, attention shifts from what allegedly happened to why it is surfacing now. Timing in stories like this is never accidental. Jessica's supporters argue that this isn't a sudden outburst, but the final release after years of containment. Silence, they say, was once protection. Now it feels like self-erasure. Speaking, even carefully, becomes an act of survival rather than aggression. There is also a growing belief that Jessica underestimated how deeply the association shaped public perceptions of her. When controversy struck her in 2020, she expected at least quiet solidarity from someone who had once leaned on her so heavily. Instead, the abrupt distancing forced her to reassess the entire relationship. Friends describe that period as a psychological breaking point, when loyalty stopped feeling noble and started feeling foolish. That realization, once it sets in, rarely stays buried. Observers note how Meghan's brand has always relied on controlled vulnerability. She shares pain, but only the kind she authors. That strategy has worked remarkably well, insulating her from scrutiny while reinforcing a narrative of strength under attack. Jessica's alleged account threatens that balance by introducing vulnerability Meghan doesn't control, not political, not institutional, but personal, and personal allegations are harder to neutralize. What complicates public reaction is polarization. Supporters of Meghan dismiss the claims as recycled hostility aimed at a woman who has long attracted disproportionate scrutiny. They point to the lack of on-record statements and warn against amplifying unverified accusations. On the other side, critics argue that demanding absolute proof before even acknowledging patterns is a convenient way to silence inconvenient voices. The divide grows sharper by the day. Privately, industry insiders are watching closely. Media executives, brand partners, and publicists understand how quickly sentiment can shift when stories cross from abstract controversy into intimate betrayal. Even without formal confirmation, sustained discussion can alter reputational gravity. It's not about courtrooms, it's about credibility capital. Once that erodes, it rarely returns intact. Jessica's current restraint is strategic. Those close to her say she understands that credibility is built not by volume but by consistency. She is not flooding the media, she is letting others talk, letting timelines align, letting contradictions surface on their own. In that silence, her supporters believe, lies her strongest leverage. There's also an emotional recalibration happening. Jessica is no longer trying to be believed by everyone. She's focused on being truthful to herself and her children. That shift removes desperation from the equation, making her narrative feel steadier, less reactive. In gossip culture, calm often reads as confidence. For Meghan, the challenge is different. Ignoring the story risks letting it metastasize. Addressing it risks legitimizing it. Either move carries consequence. Her past success with strategic quiet has set expectations, but repetition dulls effectiveness. What once felt dignified can begin to look evasive. As this chapter unfolds, one truth becomes clear. This is no longer just about friendship or fallout. It's about who controls memory, who gets to define what happened when cameras were off and loyalty was presumed. Jessica appears ready to reclaim her version, not loudly, but deliberately. And in a world obsessed with image, deliberate truth can be the most disruptive force of all. As the final stretch of this story comes into view, the focus shifts from accusation to consequence. Stories like this rarely end with a single revelation. They ripple outward, affecting reputations, alliances, and long-standing assumptions about power and proximity. What began as whispers among private circles now sits in a space where public curiosity and private pain intersect, and neither side can fully control what happens next. Jessica's supporters emphasize that her greatest loss wasn't status or opportunity, but certainty. Certainty about who was safe, certainty about which relationships were real. That kind of loss doesn't fade quietly. It reshapes how someone views every interaction that follows. They say this is why she appears steadier now. She has already mourned the illusion. What remains is clarity. The broader public is left navigating competing instincts. There is fatigue with scandal, but also fascination with power dynamics exposed. People are less interested in glamour than they once were. They want to know how influence actually moves behind closed doors, who benefits, and who pays the price. In that sense, the story resonates beyond the individuals involved. It taps into a wider skepticism about curated narratives and selective truth. For Meghan, the situation highlights the fragility of distance. Physical separation from past circles doesn't always sever emotional or historical ties. California may represent reinvention, but unresolved chapters have a way of resurfacing, especially when those left behind decide they no longer consent to silence. Reinvention works best when the past is settled, not suppressed. Some observers suggest that what unsettles audiences most is not the allegation itself, but the possibility that the public version of events has always been incomplete. That discomfort fuels debate, commentary, and endless speculation. Even without definitive proof, the mere challenge to a dominant narrative forces reassessment. People begin revisiting old interviews, old photos, old timelines, searching for coherence. Jessica's future path remains intentionally ambiguous. She is not announcing projects or issuing ultimatums. That ambiguity keeps attention focused without escalation. It also protects her from being framed as opportunistic. By moving slowly, she allows others to fill the space, often to her advantage. Silence in this phase functions less as avoidance and more as pressure. The lesson emerging from this saga is stark. Proximity to power can amplify you, but it can also erase you if the balance shifts. Loyalty without reciprocity becomes liability, and narratives built too carefully can crack when confronted with lived experience that doesn't fit the script. As the story settles into public consciousness, it becomes less about choosing sides and more about recognizing patterns. Who rises? Who disappears? Who gets grace? Who is expected to endure quietly? Jessica's voice, however measured, disrupts that pattern simply by existing. In the end, this chapter closes not with resolution, but with recalibration. Reputations are reconsidered, silence is reinterpreted, and the audience, once content with polished stories, is reminded that behind every carefully managed image lies a far messier human reality. That awareness lingers long after the headlines fade.